Imagine living through a time when every meal was a matter of survival. During the Great Depression, families had to get creative with what they ate, stretching every dollar and preserving every scrap. But out of that struggle came something incredible: foods that stood the test of time, stockpiled by those who knew how to make every bite count. And here's the wild part: some of those foods never expire. That's right, nearly a century later, many of the survival staples from the Great Depression are still just as good as the day they were stored. These are the ultimate prepper's dream, foods that can sit in your pantry for decades, ready when you need them most. So, what did people back then rely on? From simple staples like rice and beans to surprising choices you wouldn't expect, we're counting down 21 foods that last forever and why you should stock up on them today. Whether you're into emergency preparedness, historical survival tips, or just curious about how people made it through one of the toughest times in history, stick around because you might want to add some of these to your pantry ASAP. Let's dive in. 1. Honey. During the Great Depression, food scarcity and economic hardship forced people to stockpile non-perishable foods to survive. Among these, honey stood out as a valuable and practical choice. Unlike other food items that required refrigeration or had short expiration dates, honey provided a long-lasting, nutritious, and natural source of sweetness that could be stored indefinitely. One of the reasons honey was stockpiled during the Great Depression was its extraordinary shelf life. Unlike grains or canned goods that could spoil over time, honey never truly expires. This is due to its low moisture content and high acidity, which prevent bacterial growth and spoilage. Archaeologists have even discovered pots of honey in ancient Egyptian tombs that remained unspoiled for thousands of years. People during the Depression recognized this remarkable quality and stored honey as a reliable food source. Additionally, honey served multiple purposes beyond being a sweetener. It was used as a natural remedy for sore throats, a preservative for fruits, and even an ingredient in homemade bread and baked goods. Its versatility made it an essential item in many households. In times of economic hardship, foods with long shelf lives were crucial for survival. Honey exemplifies the ingenuity of people during the Great Depression, proving that nature's own preservative could outlast generations. Honey wasn't the only staple that stood the test of time. When it came to affordable, filling, and long-lasting food, another pantry essential proved its worth. 2. White rice. The Great Depression had gripped the world, and people were scrambling to stockpile whatever food they could get their hands on. Among the bags of flour, cans of beans, and sacks of potatoes, one item stood out: white rice. Why? Because white rice was cheap, filling, and most importantly, it never expired. Seriously, unlike brown rice, which contains oils that can go rancid over time, white rice is milled and stripped of its bran, making it virtually immortal if stored properly. Families struggling to make ends meet could buy massive sacks of the stuff and keep it for years, even decades, without it going bad. During the Depression, white rice was a staple for soups, stews, and whatever meals could be stretched to feed a whole family. It was a reliable, carb-loaded energy source that didn't need refrigeration, an absolute game changer when electricity was a luxury. Fast forward nearly a century, and those same bags of Depression-era white rice, if stored in a cool, dry place, they're probably still good today. That's right, white rice is one of the few foods that outlasted the crisis that made it famous. So if you're preparing for the next disaster, take a page from history and stock up. Because white rice isn't just food, it's survival. And just like white rice, dried beans became a lifeline. 3. Dried beans. Picture this. It's the 1930s, the Great Depression is in full swing, and people are struggling to put food on the table. Grocery stores, half empty, money scarce. But one food stood the test of time, stretching meals for families across America: dried beans. Why dried beans? Well, they were cheap, packed with protein, and, most importantly, never really expired. That's right, if stored properly, dried beans can last decades. In fact, historians and survivalists have found beans stockpiled from the Depression era that are still technically edible today. Sure, they might need a little extra soaking and cooking, but they won't go bad like fresh produce or canned goods. Families in the 1930s relied on beans for everything: soups, stews, even mashed into patties when meat was too expensive. They were the backbone of survival. You could buy a massive sack of dried beans, stash them away, and still have food months or even years later. And let's be honest, that kind of food security was priceless during an economic collapse. Fast forward to today, and dried beans are still a prepping essential. Whether you're bracing for an emergency or just trying to save on groceries, they remain a tried and true staple. The Great Depression proved it. When times get tough, beans have your back. Like dried beans, lentils were a cheap, protein-rich staple that kept families fed through tough times. 4. Lentils. Picture this: America in the 1930s. The Great Depression is in full swing. Food is scarce, money even scarcer. People are stockpiling whatever they can to survive, and one humble legume rises above the rest: lentils. Lentils were cheap, nutritious, and get this, they never expired. That's right, families that hoarded lentils back then could have passed them down like family heirlooms. Why were lentils such a game changer? Well, for starters, they packed a serious nutritional punch. Protein, fiber, iron, you name it. During a time when meat was a luxury, lentils were the ultimate survival food. Lentils were also ridiculously easy to cook. No refrigeration needed, no fancy ingredients. Just water, heat, and maybe some salt if you were lucky. They could be turned into soups, stews, or mashed into patties. And the best part? They lasted forever. Yep, as long as they're kept dry. Lentils don't really go bad. Unlike rice, which can attract pests, or canned goods that eventually expire, lentils remain edible decades later. So next time you're meal prepping for the apocalypse, take a tip from our Depression-era ancestors and stock up on lentils. Because some foods never go out of style. Lentils weren't the only hearty staple. Wheat berries provided another nutrient-packed, long-lasting food that kept families going. 5. Wheat berries. In an era when families had to stretch every dollar, every meal, and every ounce of food they had, there was one food, one incredible, shelf-stable powerhouse that never expired. Meet the wheat berry. Wheat berries are the whole, unprocessed kernels of wheat. They were a lifeline for families who needed food that could last. Well, forever. No refrigeration, no fancy packaging, just nature's perfect survival food. During the Great Depression, people stockpiled wheat berries because they were cheap, nutritious, and versatile. You could grind them into flour for homemade bread, boil them into a hearty porridge, or even sprout them for fresh greens. But here's the crazy part: wheat berries never go bad. If stored properly in a cool, dry place, they can last for decades. In fact, archaeologists have found wheat in ancient Egyptian tombs that's still edible. So why did people stop using them? Convenience took over. Processed foods became the norm. But today, with rising food costs and supply chain issues, wheat berries are making a comeback. Packed with fiber, protein, and essential nutrients, wheat berries are a budget-friendly, long-lasting survival food. And the best part? They taste amazing. So, is it time to bring back this Depression-era staple? Let us know in the comments. Wheat berries were a reliable staple, but when it came to thickening soups and stretching meals, cornstarch was the secret weapon. 6. Cornstarch. Cornstarch, you might ask. Would you be surprised if I told you this stuff lasts forever? Seriously, if you were to stumble upon a canister of cornstarch from the Depression era, chances are it's still perfectly fine to use today. Unlike flour, which can go rancid, or sugar, which can clump, cornstarch is virtually immortal, assuming it's kept dry. And that's exactly why so many families stockpiled it during the toughest economic times in American history. Cornstarch wasn't just a thickener for soups and gravies, it was a multi-purpose miracle powder. It could bulk up meals, stretch ingredients, and even be used as a substitute for eggs in baking. People got creative, using it in homemade puddings, sauces, and even as a cheap alternative to baby powder. Fast forward to today, and cornstarch is still a kitchen essential, but its history as a Depression-era lifesaver, that's the kind of stuff that makes you appreciate the small, seemingly unimportant items in your pantry. So next time you see that dusty box of cornstarch, remember, it's not just a thickener, it's a survivor. Beyond thickening and cooking, preservation was key, and nothing did it better than vinegar. 7. Vinegar. Vinegar was an essential item during the Depression era, prized not only for its ability to enhance flavors, but also for its impressive preservation properties. Unlike many perishable food items, vinegar does not expire in the traditional sense. Its high acidity prevents bacterial growth, allowing it to remain safe for consumption indefinitely. Vinegar played a crucial role in food preservation during this era. With refrigeration being a luxury for many, people relied on pickling to extend the shelf life of vegetables, fruits, and even meats. Pickling in vinegar helped families maintain a steady food supply through harsh winters and economic hardships. Additionally, vinegar was a key ingredient in making homemade condiments, such as mustard and salad dressings, adding variety to otherwise monotonous meals. Beyond its culinary uses, vinegar was valued for its medicinal and cleaning properties. Many households used it as a natural disinfectant, a remedy for ailments, and a tool for preserving hygiene in difficult times. Its multifunctionality made it a staple in nearly every home. Even today, vinegar remains a testament to the resilience of those who endured the Great Depression. Its enduring shelf life and countless uses make it a symbol of resourcefulness and survival. Vinegar wasn't the only pantry staple with an endless shelf life. Maple syrup proved just as timeless. 8. Maple syrup. Now, you might be wondering, how did maple syrup survive the Great Depression and beyond? Unlike many perishable foods, pure maple syrup doesn't expire. If stored properly in a sealed container, it can last for decades without spoiling. Why? Because its high sugar content creates an environment where bacteria and mold struggle to grow. During the Great Depression, families, especially in the Northeast and Canada, relied on maple syrup as a source of natural sweetness when processed sugar was too expensive. It was drizzled on cornbread, mixed into oatmeal, and even used to flavor homemade baked goods. In hard times, a little sweetness went a long way. Even today, unopened pure maple syrup remains a pantry staple with an almost indefinite shelf life. And if it ever does develop mold, just skim it off, boil the syrup, and it's good as new. The Great Depression may be long gone, but its lessons and its flavors still live on. So next time you pour that golden goodness over your pancakes, just remember you're tasting history. Maple syrup added sweetness to tough times, but for some, hard liquor provided a different kind of comfort, one that never went bad. 9. Hard liquor. Hard liquor was one of those items that really stood the test of time alongside some other foods during the Depression era. Unlike most foods, whiskey, rum, and other spirits don't expire. While milk sours, bread molds, and vegetables rot, a bottle of bourbon can sit on a shelf for decades and still pack the same punch. But why was alcohol such a staple during the Depression? For one, it was currency. Prohibition had just ended in 1933, and with the economy in shambles, alcohol was more than just a drink. It was a tradable asset. A well-stocked liquor cabinet meant security. People bartered with bottles of whiskey the way they did with sugar and coffee. Then, there was the psychological escape. When times got tough, people sought comfort. A sip of something strong helped them forget the struggle, even if just for a moment. And the best part? Unlike most stockpiled goods, liquor never expired. If stored properly, a bottle from the Great Depression could still be cracked open today. So while food came and went, hard liquor remained an enduring relic of survival in America's hardest times. Next, we have baking soda. 10. Baking soda. Did you know that one of the most commonly stockpiled foods during the Great Depression is still sitting in kitchen cabinets today? Completely usable? That's right, baking soda, the simple white powder we use for everything from baking to cleaning, was a must-have survival staple during the toughest economic times in American history. But why? And how has it managed to stay relevant and fresh nearly a century later? During the Great Depression, families had to stretch every penny and make every item last as long as possible. With jobs scarce and money tight, food shortages became a real problem. People turned to non-perishable goods, and baking soda quickly became a pantry essential. Unlike flour and canned goods, which could spoil or go stale, baking soda had an almost magical property. It never really expired. So, what makes baking soda so special? It's a chemical compound called sodium bicarbonate, which is incredibly stable. As long as it's kept dry and away from moisture, it won't break down over time. Unlike baking powder, which loses potency, baking soda remains just as effective decades later. That means a box from the 1930s, if stored properly, could still help you bake a fresh loaf of bread today. Beyond cooking, baking soda was a Depression-era lifesaver for cleaning, deodorizing, brushing teeth, and even relieving indigestion. Its versatility made it invaluable, and that's why it remains a household staple today. Next time you see that little orange box in your pantry, remember, you're holding a piece of history. Would you trust a 90-year-old baking soda? Let us know in the comments. While hard liquor offered a lasting indulgence, powdered milk provided a practical, nutrient-rich solution for families in need. 11. Powdered milk. Powdered milk was stockpiled in massive quantities during the Great Depression. It was cheap, lightweight, and most importantly, it practically never expired. Unlike fresh milk, which spoiled in days, powdered milk could last for decades if stored properly. Believe it or not, there are still cans of powdered milk from that era that remain edible today. Because it's dehydrated, bacteria and mold can't grow, preserving its nutritional value. In fact, even today, preppers and survivalists rely on powdered milk as a long-term food source. Whether during the Great Depression or modern times, powdered milk has proven to be an essential survival food. It's a reminder that sometimes the simplest innovations are the most reliable. What other foods do you think could last 100 years? Let us know in the comments. Powdered milk kept families nourished, but for a much-needed boost, instant coffee was the go-to choice. 12. Instant coffee. At number 12, we have instant coffee. Instant coffee was a new invention in the early 20th century, but it became a crucial survival tool during the 1930s. Unlike fresh coffee, which could go stale, instant coffee had a near infinite shelf life. Families stockpiled jars of the stuff, knowing it could last through tough times. And here's the crazy part, it never really expired. Thanks to its low moisture content, instant coffee can still be drinkable decades later. In fact, people have found unopened jars from the Depression era that still dissolve perfectly in hot water. Instant coffee was more than just a caffeine fix. It was a symbol of resilience. In a time when every scrap of food mattered, this little jar of powder proved that sometimes the simplest innovations stand the test of time. Who knew that a product born out of hardship would still be in our kitchens today? Instant coffee kept spirits up, but when it came to filling meals, dried pasta was a dependable staple. 13. Dried pasta. Okay guys, next on our list is something most people won't believe can be stored for a long time. Yes, it's dried pasta. Dried pasta was one of the unsung heroes of the Depression era, a simple, inexpensive, and nearly immortal food that families stockpiled because it never really expired. With limited refrigeration and unstable food supplies, people needed something that could sit on the shelf for months, if not years. Made from just wheat and water, dried pasta was not only cheap, but also packed with carbs for energy. Even decades later, dried pasta remains edible as long as it's stored in a cool, dry place. It turns out, pasta's longevity isn't just legend. Unlike fresh food that spoils, dried pasta resists bacteria, making it one of the Depression-era foods that truly stood the test of time. So, next time you grab that dusty box of spaghetti, just remember, it might outlive us all. Dried pasta filled stomachs, but for a touch of comfort, cocoa powder brought a taste of sweetness that lasted forever. 14. Cocoa powder. Up next, we have cocoa powder. Let's take a look at how cocoa powder became one of the ultimate survival foods. That's right, this chocolatey goodness was stockpiled in the 1930s and incredibly never really expired. Let's break it down. Staples like flour, sugar, and canned goods were popular. But cocoa powder, that was a game changer. Unlike fresh milk or even chocolate bars, cocoa powder is low in moisture, which means bacteria and mold can't easily grow on it. Cocoa powder doesn't really go bad, at least not in the way most foods do. As long as it's kept in a dry, cool place, it can last decades. Some unopened tins from the Great Depression have even been found still usable today. So next time you sip on some cocoa, just remember you're enjoying a survival superfood from history. Cocoa powder added a hint of indulgence, but molasses brought a rich, lasting sweetness with a nutritional boost. 15. Molasses. Among the staple foods that kept people going during the Depression era, one thick, sticky, and surprisingly nutritious ingredient stood out: molasses. That's right, this humble syrup wasn't just a sweetener, it was a survival tool. Cheap, long-lasting, and packed with essential nutrients, molasses became a pantry must-have. But why did molasses become a Depression-era favorite? First off, it never really expires. Unlike fresh foods that spoiled quickly, molasses had an almost infinite shelf life if stored properly. Families could stock up and rely on it for years. It was also a powerhouse of nutrition. Rich in iron, calcium, and magnesium, molasses helped combat malnutrition when meat and dairy were scarce. People also got creative. Molasses wasn't just for baking, it was stirred into warm water for a makeshift energy drink, drizzled over cornbread, or mixed into beans for added flavor. Even today, some families still keep molasses in their pantries, a sweet reminder of resilience. So next time you see a bottle, remember, this isn't just syrup, it's history. Molasses provided sweetness, but for a long-lasting cooking fat, ghee was the ultimate pantry essential. 16. Ghee, clarified butter. Unlike regular butter, clarified butter, also known as ghee, was a game changer. Unlike regular butter, which spoils in weeks, ghee lasts for years, even decades, without refrigeration. So, how did this ancient superfood become a Depression-era survival staple? People during the Depression relied on non-perishable foods like canned goods, dried beans, and ghee. By slowly simmering butter and removing the milk solids, they created a pure fat that wouldn't go bad. Plus, it was packed with calories, exactly what struggling families needed. Fast forward to today, and ghee is still going strong. Whether for cooking, health benefits, or emergency prepping, it's proof that the best survival foods have been around forever. Ghee kept meals rich and flavorful, but for a protein-packed survival food, nothing beat pemmican. 17. Pemmican. Up next, we have pemmican, one of the most powerful survival foods in history. A meat-based, high-energy superfood that never expired, pemmican was stockpiled by those who knew how to prepare for the worst. Pemmican wasn't just a product of the Great Depression, it had already been around for centuries. Originally created by indigenous peoples of North America, pemmican is a powerful mix of dried meat, rendered fat, and sometimes berries. It was designed to last for years, even decades, without spoiling. Sounds like the perfect survival food, right? The key to pemmican's longevity is in its ingredients. The meat is dried until it's brittle, ground into a powder, and then mixed with hot fat. This creates a dense, nutrient-packed food that resists spoilage because it lacks moisture, which is the #1 cause of food going bad. During the Great Depression, pemmican became a lifesaver for many. It was cheap to make, stored easily, and packed enough calories to sustain people through tough times. Those who had access to meat and fat, whether from hunting, farming, or even scraps, could create pemmican and keep it for years. Some families stockpiled it in tin cans, wrapping it in cloth, or keeping it in cool, dry places. One of the most fascinating things about pemmican is that it practically never expires. There are reports of over 100-year-old pemmican being found and still being edible. Because it's so rich in fats and proteins, it was even used by Arctic explorers and the military. Compare that to modern canned goods, which have a shelf life of just a few years. Today, pemmican is making a comeback. With the rise of survival prepping and interest in traditional foods, many people are rediscovering this ancient, stockpiled food. Whether you're preparing for an emergency or just want to try a piece of history, pemmican remains the ultimate survival food, just as it was during the Great Depression. So, what do you think? Would you stockpile pemmican in your emergency supply? Let us know in the comments. Pemmican provided energy, but for a nearly indestructible source of sustenance, hardtack was the go-to choice. 18. Hardtack. The Great Depression was one of the darkest economic periods in history, and people had to get creative to survive. But what if I told you that one simple food, stockpiled back then, never actually expired? That's right, meat hardtack, the ultimate survival food. So, what exactly is hardtack? Well, it's about as simple as it gets: flour, water, and maybe a pinch of salt. That's it. No fancy ingredients, no preservatives, yet this rock-solid biscuit has been keeping people alive for centuries. Think of it as the OG energy bar, used by sailors, soldiers, and, you guessed it, struggling families during the Great Depression. With food shortages and unpredictable grocery supplies, people needed something they could make cheaply and store indefinitely. Hardtack was the perfect solution. It was easy to make, cheap, and most importantly, lasted forever, literally. During the 1930s, people didn't have refrigerators or freezers like we do today, and canned goods were expensive. Hardtack, on the other hand, could be baked in bulk and stored in tins or cloth sacks for years. And when I say years, I mean decades. Now, if you've ever tried eating hardtack straight up, you know it's like biting into a rock. That's why people soaked it in coffee, soup, or water to soften it before eating. But here's the wild part. If kept dry, hardtack doesn't really spoil. Archaeologists have found pieces from the Civil War that are still technically edible. So if you made some in 1930 and kept it in a dry place, you could still eat it today. Pretty crazy, right? In a world obsessed with expiration dates and food waste, maybe there's something to learn from the Great Depression. Simple, long-lasting foods like hardtack might just be the ultimate survival snack. So would you try it? Let us know in the comments. Hardtack provided sustenance, but when it came to adding flavor to simple meals, bouillon cubes were an absolute lifesaver. 19 bouillon cubes. Up next, we have bouillon cubes. First of all, what are bouillon cubes? For those who might not know, bouillon cubes are small, concentrated cubes of dehydrated broth or stock, typically made from meat, such as beef, chicken, or fish, vegetables, seasonings, and salt. They dissolve in hot water to create a quick and flavorful broth for soups, stews, sauces, and other dishes. They are a convenient alternative to homemade stock and come in various flavors, including vegetarian options. So, why did bouillon cubes become a survival essential? First, they were cheap. A tiny cube could flavor an entire pot of water. Second, they were compact and long-lasting, packed with salt and dehydrated ingredients, which made them nearly immune to spoilage. Even today, decades-old bouillon cubes remain safe to eat, though maybe a little less flavorful. During the 1930s, families hoarded whatever could last: canned goods, dried beans, and yes, bouillon cubes were stockpiled because they provided instant flavor to otherwise bland meals. A pot of hot broth could make simple bread or potatoes feel like a feast. Even now, bouillon cubes are a survivalist's dream, proving that some foods never truly expire. So next time you see one, remember, you're holding a tiny piece of history. What other survival foods do you think could last forever? Let's continue to find out. 20. Popcorn. What if I told you that one of the best survival foods of the Great Depression is still sitting in pantries today? Perfectly edible. Yep, we're talking about popcorn. This crunchy, buttery movie snack actually has a long history as a cheap, long-lasting, and stockpile-friendly food. But how did popcorn become a go-to survival food during one of the worst economic crises in history? And why does it never seem to expire? Let's find out. Unlike fresh produce or meat, popcorn kernels could be stored for decades without spoiling. It was inexpensive, easy to make, and provided a much-needed comfort food during tough times. Plus, it was a great way to keep kids happy when other snacks were simply out of reach. Okay, so how does popcorn last forever? The secret lies in the kernels. Popcorn is a type of maize with a hard outer shell that locks in moisture. As long as it's stored in a cool, dry place, that protective shell prevents it from spoiling. Unlike bread or dairy, popcorn doesn't grow mold or bacteria easily. And unlike oil-based snacks, it doesn't go rancid. In fact, archaeologists have found popcorn kernels in ancient tombs that are over 5,000 years old, and some of them still pop. Popcorn wasn't just a survival food, it was a lifeline for struggling businesses. During the Great Depression, while many industries collapsed, popcorn sales skyrocketed. At just 5 to 10 cents a bag, it was one of the few affordable luxuries people could still enjoy. Movie theaters, which were also struggling, started selling popcorn to boost profits. And guess what? It worked. Popcorn became so popular that even after the Depression ended, it stayed a movie theater staple. So, next time you grab a bag of popcorn for movie night, remember, it's more than just a snack. It's a relic of survival, a business success story, and one of the few foods that never truly expires. Who knew this little kernel had such a big history? For a naturally sweet and everlasting treat, raw honeycomb was unmatched. 21. Raw honeycomb. Finally, on our list, we have raw honeycomb. That's right, this golden hexagonal miracle was a lifesaver for many struggling families. But what made it so special, and why does it never expire? During the Great Depression, people had to be smart about food storage. They relied on non-perishable items that could last for months, sometimes years without refrigeration. But there was one problem. Even canned food has a shelf life. This is where raw honeycomb came in. Unlike other perishable items, honeycomb didn't just last a few years, it lasted forever. In fact, archaeologists have discovered pots of honey in ancient Egyptian tombs that are over 3,000 years old and still perfectly edible. So what's the secret? It all comes down to 3 things. 1. Low moisture content. Bacteria and mold need water to grow, but honey is so thick and dehydrated that it naturally prevents spoilage. 2. Acidic pH. Honey is slightly acidic, creating an environment where microbes just can't survive. 3. Natural enzymes. Bees add special enzymes that produce hydrogen peroxide, a natural preservative. Now, let's take it a step further. Raw honeycomb takes these benefits up a notch. Because it's sealed by the bees themselves, it stays untouched and pure, locking in freshness for decades. And the best part? If you stored it right, you could pass it down for generations. Imagine opening a jar of honey your great-grandparents kept, and it's still as good as the day they stored it. Fast forward to today, raw honeycomb is still a powerhouse food. It's organic, full of health benefits, and a delicious reminder that nature's best preservative is nature itself. And there you have it, folks. 21 foods that got families through the Great Depression and can still last forever in your pantry today. Stocking up on these items isn't just about history. It's about smart prepping, saving money, and being ready for anything. Whether it's honey, dried beans, or canned goods, these staples stand the test of time. So, which of these do you already have in your pantry? Did we miss any? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more survival and prepping tips.